Hi, good morning, everybody. This is the next phase in our story on Hebrews, our Bible study. We're in Hebrews chapter 9 this morning, and we're going to compare the Old and the New Covenant. I'm just going to read the first 5 verses, break it up into nice bite-sized chunks. Then indeed, even the first covenant had ordinances of divine service and the earthly sanctuary. For a tabernacle was prepared, the first part in which was the lampstand, the table and the showbread, which is called the sanctuary, and behind the second veil the part of the tabernacle which is called the holiest of all, which had the golden censer and the ark of the covenant, overlaid on all sides with gold, in which was a golden pot that had the manna, Aaron's rod that budded, and the tablets of the covenant, and above it were the 2 cherubim of glory, overshadowing the mercy seat. Of these things we cannot speak now in detail. The tabernacle that was ordained by the Old Covenant was planned by God, but planned for earthly service. It was roughly, and I've got to say roughly, 45 feet long, or 15 meters long, and probably 5 meters wide, 15 meters high, 5 meters high, divided into 2 rooms. The first room, the larger one, the outer sanctuary, was 5 meters by 10. That's the holy place, and behind that, behind the second veil, there was a smaller room, which was 5 meters by 5 meters, which was the holiest of all. The reason we can't be too sure on measurements is that it was worked out in cubits. A cubit is the measurement from your elbow to your fingertips. Now, if you're like me, you've got short arms, you probably need a lot more cubits than somebody who's 6'4" and whose arms are considerably longer. So there's some difficulty in saying actually how big this was. If you really want to see the tabernacle, Google tabernacle in the Negev desert, and you'll see a life-size replica that a couple of Israeli guys have built out there to make it a tourist attraction. Anyway, the setting for the lamps of the tabernacle, it had a middle stem and 6 branches. It was of an unspecified size, made of pure gold and provided the only light. You can find the description for these things in Exodus 25. The table that was in the first part was made of acacia wood and covered with gold, 3 feet long, 4.5 wide, 2 feet 3 inches high. It had 12 loaves of showbread, each loaf representing one of the tribes of Israel, and it represented God's fellowship. So the sanctuary is the first part. It's known as the holy place. And a veil, not a veil that we think of these days that you see through, but a thick curtain made of animal skins separated the first part from the Holy of Holies. The golden altar of incense was made of acacia wood, covered with gold, 1.5 meters square and 1 meter high. It stood at the veil before the Holy of Holies and was used to burn incense. Now you remember, if you remember the story of Zechariah and Elizabeth, the parents of John the Baptist, Zechariah had been chosen as part of his division to go to Jerusalem. His name was picked out to burn incense, and that is where he would have burned the incense, at the veil in front of the curtain that closed off the Holy of Holies. That was a once-in-a-lifetime thing for a priest. Once they'd done it, their name was taken out of the lots, and they could never be drawn out again. Inside the ark were the golden pot and with the manna, Aaron's rod, the 2 stone tablets. So the manna reminds Israel of God's provision and also of their ungratefulness, because if you remember, they started to moan about eating the same thing. Aaron's rod reminded Israel of their rebellion against God. Certain leaders of other tribes tried to remove Aaron from his place. And the tablets of the covenant remind Israel of their failure to keep the 10 commandments. So the mercy seat is the ornate lid for the Ark of the Covenant. made with two cherubim who kind of overshadow the whole thing, and their wings touch in the middle, and the blood of sacrifice was sprinkled on it for the forgiveness of Israel's sin on the Day of Atonement. As God looked down into the ark, he saw the symbols of Israel's sin, rebellion, and their failure. But when the blood of sacrifice was applied to the mercy seat, that sacrificial blood hid the sins of Israel from his view. Okay, so priestly service in the tabernacle. Let's read the next two verses, verse 6 and 7. When these things had been thus prepared, the priests always went into the first part of the tabernacle, performing the services. But into the second part, the high priest went alone once a year, not without blood, which he offered for himself and for the people's sins committed in ignorance. The priests, as they were told to, as they were appointed, when the lots were drawn, they would be given jobs to do, and that was their job for the time that they were serving in Jerusalem. They went every day into the holy place to perform the priestly functions, like tending the lampstand, making sure the showbread's replaced every day, and I guess lots of other things as well. The second part, the Holy of Holies, was only entered once a year by the high priest on his own on the Day of Atonement. The high priest was not going there to have fellowship with God, that was not the plan, but to atone for the sins of the nation. But first he had to atone for his own sins, and then for the sins of the people. So the access into the holiest place was severely restricted. And even when someone could enter it, it wasn't for a fellowship with God. Ancient Jewish rabbis tell of how the high priest never prolonged his prayer in the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement because it might make the people think he'd been killed. And when he came out, he threw a party for all his friends because he'd emerged safely from the presence of God. There's a popular legend that says the high priest, when he went in, would have a rope tied around his ankle or around his waist. There's no reference to this in the Bible, in Josephus, or any of the early writings, but according to ancient rabbis in the Talmud, the high priest wore a rope around his waist as he made his way into the Holy of Holies. The rope is there for a very practical purpose, because in the event that the high priest did or said something wrong, it was generally believed that he would be struck dead by God. Now, as only the high priest could enter the Holy of Holies, the rope allowed his assistants to pull the corpse of the high priest out in the event of mishap, struck down by God. The high priest also wore bells on his robe, and whilst the bells were tinkling, they knew the high priest was moving around in the sanctuary, and so must be alive. The Day of Atonement was all about sins of ignorance. It was assumed that known sin would be taken care of through the regular sin offerings and daily sacrifices. So in this respect, Jesus' work is much greater than the work done on the Day of Atonement, because Jesus' work on the cross is sufficient to atone for both the sins we do in ignorance and the sins that we know. Next couple of verses, 8 to 10. The Holy Spirit indicating this, that the way into the holiest of all was not yet made manifest while the first tabernacle was still standing. It was symbolic for the present time in which both gifts and sacrifices are offered, which cannot make him who performed the service perfect in regard to the conscience, concerned only with foods and drinks, various washings, and fleshly ordinances imposed until the time of Reformation. Whilst the first tabernacle was still standing, you could not get into the Holy of Holies because the old had to pass away before the new could be revealed. It was symbolic for the present. And the tabernacle, all that the Old Covenant represented, were pointing towards deeper truths which we find in the New Covenant. The priestly service in the Old Testament could not make the priest offering those sacrifices perfect and clean in regard to their conscience. So if cleansing is incomplete for the priest, how much more for the person the priest was working for? The weakness of the priest under the old covenant was its inability to address the need for inner transformation in man, so it was only imposed until the time of Reformation. So verse 11 tells us about the superior sanctuary of the new covenant. But Christ came as high priest of the good things to come, with the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation. Jesus is our great high priest. He ministers in a superior temple to that of the earthly high priest, because he stands in the throne room of God, which is obviously a much greater place than any human hands can build. The next 4 verses then, 12 through 15, is about the superior sacrifice of the new covenant. Not with the blood of goats and calves, but with his own blood he entered the most holy place, once for all, having obtained eternal redemption. For if the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of a heifer, sprinkling the unclean, sanctifies for the purifying of the flesh, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God? And for this reason he is the mediator of the new covenant by means of death, for the redemption of the transgressions under the first covenant, that those who are called may receive the promise of the eternal. Okay, so animal sacrifice was sufficient for a temporary covering for sin, but only a perfect sacrifice can offer eternal redemption. The sacrifice that Jesus made was superior in that it was perfect, voluntary, rational, and motivated purely by love. At the tabernacle, the sacrifice is made outside the Holy of Holies at the altar, but the blood is brought into the Holy of Holies because that represented the throne room of God. So Jesus, when he died here on earth, he died outside heaven, just as the sacrifices were killed outside the holiest place. He died outside Jerusalem as well. But the payment his death made for the sins of the world had to be satisfied in heaven itself. When the high priest entered the most holy place, he went through the curtain and he let the curtain fall behind him. He did the same as he left, which means there was still a barrier between God and man. Now when Jesus was crucified, we all read the gospel accounts of the crucifixion, the barrier was torn in two from top to bottom, opening the way for him to enter heaven itself, but to stay there to welcome us. Christianity is all about access. It is not about barriers. Spurgeon says that the Lord Jesus did not come to earth to make a reconciliation by the holiness of his life or by the earnestness of his teaching, but by his death. The blood of bulls and goats was offered as sacrifice for purifying the flesh and accepted by God under the old covenant. But these were imperfect sacrifices, but they were accepted. So the perfect sacrifice must be perfectly sufficient. A young cow, a heifer, was offered as a burnt offering, the ashes sprinkled in the basin that was used for ceremonial cleansing. How much more shall the blood of Christ cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God? The sacrifice of Jesus is sufficient to even restore our damaged conscience. Our conscience is a wonderful tool from God, but it isn't perfect. Our conscience can be seared, because he says, some will depart from the faith, giving heed to the deceiving spirits and doctrines of demons, speaking lies in hypocrisy, having their own conscience seared with a hot iron. That's 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 2. Our conscience can be defiled. To those who are defiled and unbelieving, nothing is pure, but even their mind and conscience are defiled. Titus 1, verse 15. And our conscience can also be evil, having our hearts sprinkled from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Hebrews 10:22. Hebrews tells us to cleanse our conscience from dead works. The idea here is most likely of sin in general, in the sense that the work only brings death. But it also speaks of the useless continuation of old covenant sacrifice, to which our disappointed young Jewish Christians were wanting to return. As believers, we are cleansed, conscience, soul, spirit, so we could not serve ourselves or any other man, but only the living God. Jesus' work as a mediator is fundamentally accomplished at his death. His heavenly work of mediation looks back to that perfect sacrifice. His payment on the cross is seen by some as accomplishing redemption for those under the first covenant. But every sacrifice for sin made in faith under the Mosaic command was an IOU that was paid in full at the cross. Right, 6 verses here between 16 and 22 talks about the necessity of Jesus' death. Where there is a testament, there must also of necessity be the death of the testator. For a testament is in force only after men are dead, since it has no power at all while the testator lives. Therefore, not even the first covenant was dedicated without blood. For when Moses had spoken every precept to all the people according to the law, he took the blood of calves and goats with water, scarlet wool, and hyssop, and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant." And likewise he sprinkled with blood both the tabernacle and all the vessels of the ministry. And according to the law, almost all things are purified with blood, and without shedding of blood there is no remission. So a testament, like a last will and testament, it only comes into power when the person who has made it dies. So Jesus had to die for the testament, the covenant, to take effect. Now death was clearly necessary to the old covenant, because virtually every part of the sacrificial system under the law of Moses was touched by blood in some way or another. Without blood there is no remission. This is a foundational principle of God's dealings with men. Modern people think that sin is remitted or forgiven by time, by good works, by our decent lives, or simply by death. But there is no forgiveness without the shedding of blood, and there is no perfect forgiveness without a perfect sacrifice. In his sermon, The Blood Shedding, Spurgeon showed 3 fools. The first is a soldier wounded on the field of battle. The medic comes to treat him, and immediately the soldier wants to know everything about the rifle and the soldier that shot him. The second fool is a ship's captain whose ship is about to go down in a terrible storm, and instead of being at the wheel of his ship, he's down in his cabin studying charts, trying to find out where the storm has come from. The third fool is a man who's sick and dying with sin and about to go under the waves of God's justice. Yet he's deeply troubled about the origin of evil. We should look to the solution more than to the problem, should we? 23 to 28, which I think is the last part. Yeah. Verses 23 to 28. The perfect sanctuary and the perfect sacrifice. So it was necessary that the copies of the things in the heavens should be purified with these, but the heavenly things themselves are better sacrifices. For Christ has not entered the holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. Not that he should offer himself often, as a high priest enters the most holy place every year with the blood of another. He then would have had to suffer often since the foundations of the world. But now, once at the end of the ages, he has appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And as it is appointed for men to die once, but after this the judgment, so Christ was offered once to bear the sins of many. To those who eagerly wait for him, he will appear a second time, apart from sin, for salvation. So it was acceptable for the copies of the things in heaven in the earthly sanctuary to be purified with imperfect sacrifices. But the heavenly things themselves can only be purified with a perfect offering. The sacrifice Jesus made was made on earth, but it is the basis for his continuing work as our mediator and great high priest in heaven. The writer of Hebrews proclaims this, and now to appear in the presence of God for us. It's not hard to believe that Jesus does appear in the presence of God, but to believe that he appears there for us is glorious. Not that he should offer himself often. Jesus' ministry for us continues in heaven, but not in the sense of continuing to atone for our sin. His ministry continues for us in intercession and defending us against the accuser of God's people. It does not continue in the sense that he should offer himself often, because his sacrifice was once for all and perfectly satisfied God's holy justice. There are some in the Christian world who make it a practice to repeat, not to remember, but to repeat the atoning sacrifice of Jesus innumerable times. And this denies the finished work of Jesus Christ on the cross. The scriptures make it plain, not that he should offer himself often. He then would have had to suffer often since the foundation of the world. If the sacrifice weren't perfect, then it would have to be continual and constant, even since the foundation of the world. The message is clear, that Jesus has appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. This principle of sacrifice explains why the suffering of hell must be eternal for those who reject the atoning work of Jesus. They are in hell to pay the penalty of their sin. But as imperfect beings, they are unable to make a perfect payment. If the payment is not perfect, then it has to be continual and constant, indeed for all eternity. The soul could be released from hell the moment its debt of sin was completely paid, which is another way of saying never. Spurgeon says a man dies once, and after that everything is fixed and settled, and he answers for his doings at the judgment. One life, one death. Then everything is weighed and the result declared. After this, the judgment. So Christ comes and dies once, and after this, for him also, the result of what he has done, namely the salvation of those who look for him. He dies once and then reaps a fixed result, according to the analogy of the human race, of which we became a member. Spurgeon. Now, it's not really the point of the writer to discuss reincarnation. He completely denies it here. We do not die and live and die and live and die and live, facing an eternal reckoning some number of lives down the road. This life is it, and then we face judgment. Now is the time to choose for Jesus Christ, because when we die, we simply face the judgment. There are some unique, remarkable exceptions to this rule. Enoch, in Genesis chapter 5, verse 24. Enoch walked with God and was not. Elijah, who was taken up to heaven in a chariot of fire, he never died. Several people in the Bible were raised from the dead. So they died twice. Those taken in the rapture, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, will never die once. Yet these remarkably unique exceptions do not deny the principle of it is appointed for men to die once. They are exceptions that prove the rule. The point of Jesus' first coming was to deal with the sin problem through his atoning sacrifice. But now, having dealt with the sin problem perfectly, he comes again apart from sin. This time he comes for the salvation in the sense of rescue of his people. Thank you very much.